Lord of the World, Part 9, Chapter 5, Part 3. 6 days later, Percy rose as usual, said his Mass, breakfast, and sat down to say office until a servant should summon him to vest for the pontifical Mass. He had learned to expect bad news now so constantly, of apostasies, deaths, losses, that the lull of the previous week had come to him with extraordinary refreshment. It appeared to him as if his musings in St. Anastasia had been truer than he thought, and that the sweetness of the old feast had not yet wholly lost its power, even over a world that denied its substance. For nothing at all had happened of importance. A few more martyrdoms had been chronicled, but they had been isolated cases, and of Felsenburgh there had been no tidings at all. Europe confessed his ignorance of his business. On the other hand, tomorrow, Percy knew very well, would be a day of extraordinary moment, in England and Germany at any rate. For in England it was appointed that the first occasion of compulsory worship throughout the country, while it was second in Germany. Men and women would have to declare themselves now. He had seen on the previous evening a photograph of the image that was to be worshipped the next day in the Abbey, and, in a fit of loathing, had torn it to shreds. It represented a nude woman, huge and majestic, entrancingly lovely, with head and shoulders thrown back, as one who sees a strange and heavenly vision, arms downstretched and hands a little raised with wide fingers, as in astonishment. The whole attitude, with feet and knees pressed together, suggestive of expectation, hope, and wonder. In a devilish mockery her long hair was crowned with 12 stars. This, then, was the spouse of the other, the embodiment of man's ideal maternity, still waiting for her child. When the white scraps lay like poisonous snow at his feet, he had sprung across the room to his prie-dieu, and fallen there in an agony of reparation. "O mother, mother," he cried to the stately Queen of Heaven, who, with her true son long ago in her arms, looked down on him from her bracket, no more than that. But he was still again this morning, and celebrated Saint Sylvester, Pope and Martyr, the last saint in the procession of the Christian year, with tolerable equanimity. The sight of the last night, the throng of officials, the stately, scarlet, unfamiliar figures of the cardinals, who had come in from the north, south, east, and west, these helped to reassure him again, unreasonably, as he knew, yet effectually. The very air was electric with expectation. All night the piazza had been crowded by a huge, silent mob, waiting till the opening of the doors at 7 o'clock. Now the church itself was full, and the piazza full again. Far down the street to the river, so far as he could see as he had leaned from his window just now, lay that solemn, motionless pavement of heads. The roof of the colonnade showed a fringe of them. The housetops were black, and this in the bitter cold of a clear, frosty morning, for it was announced that after Mass and the proceeding of the members of the order past the pontifical throne, the Pope would give apostolic benediction to the city and the world. Percy finished terse, closed his book, and lay back. His servant would be here in a minute now. His mind began to run over the function, and he reflected that the entire sacred college, with the exception of the Cardinal Protector of Jerusalem, detained by sickness, numbered 64 members, would take part. This would mean a unique sight by and by. 8 years before, he remembered, after the freedom of Rome, there had been a similar assembly, but the cardinals had at that time amounted to no more than 53 all told, and 4 had been absent. Then he heard voices in his anteroom, a quick step, and a loud English expostulation. That was curious, and he sat up. Then he heard a sentence. His Eminence must go to vest. It is useless. There was a sharp answer, a faint scuffle, and a snatch at the handle. This was indecent, so Percy stood up, made 3 strides to it, and tore open the door. A man stood there, whom at first he did not recognize, pale and disordered. "Why," began Percy, and recoiled. "Mr. Phillips," he said. The other threw out his hands. "It is I, sir, your Eminence. This moment arrived. It is life and death. Your servant tells me. Who sent you?" "Father Blackmore." "Good news or bad?" The man rolled his eyes toward the servant, who stood still, erect and offended, a yard away, and Percy understood. He put his hand on the other's arm, drawing him through the doorway. "Tap upon this door in 2 minutes, James," he said. They passed across the polished floor together. Percy went to his usual place in the window, leaned against the shutter, and spoke. "Tell me in 1 sentence, sir," he said to the breathless man. "There is a plot among the Catholics. They intend destroying the abbey tomorrow with explosives. I knew that the Pope—" Percy cut him short with a gesture. Chapter 6, Part 1. The velour stage was comparatively empty this afternoon, as the little party of 6 stepped out on it from the lift. There was nothing to distinguish from these ordinary travelers. The 2 cardinals of Germany and England were wrapped in plain furs without insignia of any kind. Their chaplains stood near them, while the 2 men-servants hurried forward with the bags to secure a private compartment. The 4 kept complete silence, watching the busy movements of the officials on board, staring unseeingly at the sleek, polished monster that lay netted in steel at their feet, and the great folded fins that would presently be cutting the thin air at 150 miles an hour. Then Percy, by a sudden movement, turned from the others, went to the open window that looked over Rome, and leaned there with his elbows on the sill. It was a strange view before him. It was darkening now toward sunset, and the sky, primrose green overhead, deepened to a clear tawny orange above the horizon, with a sanguine line or 2 at the edge, and beneath that lay the deep evening violet of the evening, blotted here and there by the black of cypresses, and cut by the thin leafless pinnacles of a poplar grove that aspired without the walls. But right now the picture rose, the enormous dome, of an indescribable tint. It was gray, it was violet, It was what the eye chose to make it, and through it, given its solidity, the air of a bubble, shone the southern sky, flushed too with faint orange. It was this that was supreme and dominant, the serrated line of domes, spires, and pinnacles, the crowded roofs beneath, in the valley del Inferno, the fairy hills far away. All were but the annex to this mighty tabernacle of God. Already lights were beginning to shine, and for 30 centuries they had shone. Thin, straight skeins of smoke were ascending against the darkened sky. The hum of this mother of cities was beginning to be still, for the keen air kept folk indoors, and the evening peace was descending that closed another day and another year. Beneath, in the narrow streets, Percy could see tiny figures, hurrying like belated ants, the crack of a whip, the cry of a woman, the wail of a child came up to this immense elevation, like details of a murmur from another world. They, too, would be quiet, and there would be peace. A heavy bell beat faintly from far away, and the drowsy city turned to murmur its good night to the Mother of God. From 1,000 towers came the tiny melody, floating across the great air spaces in 1,000 accents, the solemn bass of St. Peter's, the mellow tenor of the Lateran, the rough cry from some old slum church, the peevish tinkle of convents and chapels, all softened and made mystical in this grave evening air. It was the wedding of delicate sound and clear light. Above, the liquid orange sky, beneath this sweet, subdued ecstasy of bells. Alma Redemptoris Mater, whispered Percy, his eyes wet with tears. Gentle Mother of the Redeemer, open the door of the sky, the star of the sea, have mercy on sinners. The angel of the Lord announced it to Mary, and she conceived the Holy Ghost. Pour, therefore, Lord, thy grace into our hearts. Let us, who know Christ's incarnation, rise through passion and cross to the glory of resurrection, through the same our Lord. Another bell clanged sharply close at hand, calling him down to earth, and wrong, and labor and grief, and he turned to see the motionless volor, itself one blaze of brilliant internal light, and 2 priests following the German cardinal across the gangway. It was the rear compartment that the men had taken, and when he had seen that the old man was comfortable, still without a word, he passed out again into the central passage to see the last of Rome. The exit door had now been snapped, and as Percy stood at the opposite window looking out at the high wall that would presently sink beneath him, throughout the whole of the delicate frame began to run the vibration of the electric engine. There was the murmur of talking somewhere. A heavy step shook the floor. A bell clanged again, twice, and a sweet wind chord sounded. Again it sounded. The vibration ceased, and the edge of the high wall against the tawny sky on which he had fixed his eyes sank suddenly like a dropped bar, and he staggered a little in his place. A moment later the dome rose again, and itself sank, the city, a fringe of towers and a mass of dark roofs, pricked with light, span like a whirlpool. The jeweled stars themselves sprang this way and that. and with one more long cry the marvelous machine righted itself, beat with its wings, and settled down, with a note of the flying air passing through the rising shrillness into vibrant silence, to its long voyage to the north. Further and further sank the city behind. It was a patch now, grayness on black. The sky seemed to grow more huge and all-containing as the earth relapsed into darkness. It glowed like a vast dome of wonderful glass, darkening even as it glowed, and as Percy dropped his eyes once more around the extreme edge of the car, the city was but a line and a bubble, a line and a swelling, a line and nothingness. He drew a long breath and went back to his friends. Part 2. "Tell me again," said the old cardinal, when the two were settled down opposite to one another, and the chaplains had gone into another department. "Who is this man?" "This man? He was secretary to Oliver Brand, one of our politicians. He fetched me to old Mrs. Brand's deathbed, and lost his place in consequence. He is in journalism now. He is perfectly honest. No, he is not a Catholic, though he longs to be one. That is why they confided in him. And they, I know nothing of them, except they are a desperate set. They have enough faith to act, but not enough to be patient. I suppose they thought this man would sympathize. But unfortunately he has a conscience, and he also sees that any attempt of this kind would be the last straw on the back of toleration. Eminence, do you realize how violent the feeling is against us?" The old man shook his head lamentably. "Did I not?" he murmured. "And my Germans are in it. Are you sure?" "Eminence, it is a vast plot. It has been simmering for months. There have been meetings every week. They have kept the secret marvelously. Your Germans only delayed that the blow might be more complete. And now, tomorrow—" Percy drew back with a despairing gesture. "And the Holy Father? I went to him as soon as the Mass was over. He withdrew all opposition, and sent for you. It is our one chance, Eminence." "And do you think our plan will hinder it?" "I have no idea, but I can think of nothing else. I shall go straight to the Archbishop and tell him all. We arrive, I believe, at 3 o'clock, and you in Berlin about 7, I suppose, by German time. The function is fixed for 11. By 11, then, we shall have done all that is possible. The government will know, and they will know, too, that we are innocent in Rome. I imagine they will cause it to be announced that the Cardinal Protector and the Archbishop, with his coadjutors, will be present in the sacristies. They will double every guard. They will parade volors overhead, and then, well, in God's hands will be the rest." "Do you think the conspirators will attempt it?" "I have no idea," said Percy shortly. "I understand they have alternative plans." "Just so. If all is clear, they intend dropping the explosive from above. If not, at least 3 men had offered to sacrifice themselves by taking it into the abbey themselves." "And you, Eminence?" The old man eyed him steadily. "My program is yours," he said. "Eminence, have you considered the effect in either case? If nothing happens, we shall be accused of a fraud, of seeking to advertise ourselves. If anything happens, well, We shall all go before God together, and pray it may be the second, he added passionately. It will be at least easier to bear, observed the old man. I beg your pardon, Eminence. I should not have said that. There fell a silence between the two, in which no sound was heard but the faint untiring vibration of the screw, and the sudden cough of a man in the next compartment. Percy leaned his head wearily on one hand, and stared out the window. The earth was now dark beneath them, an immense emptiness. Above, the huge engulfing sky still faintly luminous, and through the high frosty mist through which they moved stars glimmered now and again, as the car swayed and tacked across the wind. "It will be cold among the Alps," murmured Percy. Then he broke off. "And I have not one shred of evidence," he said. "Nothing but the word of a man." "And are you sure?" "I am sure." "Eminence," said the German suddenly, staring straight into his face, "the likeness is extraordinary." Percy smiled listlessly. He was tired of bearing that. "What do you make of it?" persisted the other. "I have been asked that before," said Percy. "I have no views." "It seems to me that God means something," murmured the German heavily, still staring at him. "Well, Eminence?" "A kind of antithesis, a reverse of the medal. I do not know." Again there was silence. The chaplain looked in through the glazed door, a homely, blue-eyed German, and was waved away once more. "Eminence," said the old man abruptly, "there is surely more to speak of. Plans to be made." Percy shook his head. "There are no plans to be made," he said. "We know nothing but the fact. No names, nothing. We are like children in a tiger's cage, and one of us has just made a gesture in the tiger's face." "I suppose we shall communicate with one another?" "If we are still in existence." It was curious how Percy took the lead. He had worn his scarlet for about 3 months, and his companion for 12 years. Yet it was the younger who dictated plans and arranged. He was scarcely conscious of its strangeness, however. Ever since the shocking news of the morning, when a new mine had been sprung under the shaking church, and he had watched the stately ceremonial, the gorgeous splendor, the dignified, tranquil movements of the Pope and his court, with a secret that burned his heart and brain. Above all, since that quick interview in which old plans have been reversed, and a startling decision formed, and a blessing given and received, and a farewell looked not uttered, all done in a half-hour. His whole nature had concentrated itself into one keen, tense force, like a coiled spring. He felt power tingling in his fingertips, power and the dullness of an immense despair. Every prop had been cut, every brace severed. He, the city of Rome, the Catholic Church, and the very supernatural itself, seemed to hang now on one single thing, the finger of God. And if that failed, well, nothing would ever matter any more. He was going now to one or two things, ignominy or death. There were no third thing, unless, indeed, the conspirators were actually taken with their instruments upon them. But that was impossible. Either they would refrain, knowing that God's ministers would fall with them, And in that case there would be the ignominy of a detective fraud, of a miserable attempt to win credit. Or they would not refrain. They would count the death of a cardinal and few bishops as a cheap price to pay for revenge. And in that case, well, there was death and judgment. But Percy had ceased to fear. No ignominy would be greater than that which he already bore, the ignominy of loneliness and discredit. And death could be nothing but sweet. It would at least be knowledge and rest. He was willing to risk all on God. Presently, with a little gesture of apology, he took out his office book presently and began to read. Percy looked at him with an immense envy. Ah, if only he were as old as that. He could bear a year or two more of this misery, but not 50 years, he thought. It was an almost endless vista that, even if things went well, opened before him, of continual strife, self-repression, energy, misrepresentation from his enemies. The church was sinking further every day. What if this new spasm of fervor were no more than the dying flare of faith? How could he bear that? He would have to see the tide of atheism grow higher and more triumphant every day. Felsenburgh had given it an impetus, of whose end there was no prophesying. Never before had a single man wielded the full power of democracy. Then once more he looked forward to the morrow. Oh, if it could but end in death. Beati mortui crui in domino moretuntur. It was no good. It was cowardly to think in this fashion. After all, God was God. He takes up the isles as a very little thing. Percy took out his office book, found Prime, and St. Sylvester, signed himself with the cross, and began to pray. A minute later the two chaplains slipped in once more and sat down, and all was silent, save for the throb of the screw and the strange whispering rush of air outside. Part 3. It was about 19 o'clock that the ruddy English conductor looked in at the doorway, waking Percy from his doze. "Dinner will be served in half an hour, gentlemen," he said, speaking Esperanto, as the rule was on all international cars. "We do not stop at Turin tonight." He shut the door and went out, and the sound of closing doors came down the corridor as he made the same announcement to each compartment. There were no passengers to descend at Turin. Then, reflected Percy, and no doubt a wireless message had been received, that there were none to come on board either. That was good news. It would give him more time in London, and might even enable Cardinal Steinmann to catch an earlier velour from Paris to Berlin. But he was not sure how they ran. It was a pity that the German had not been able to catch the 13 o'clock from Rome to Berlin direct. So he calculated, in a kind of superficial insensibility. He stood up presently to stretch himself. Then he passed out, and all along the corridor to the lavatory to wash his hands. He became fascinated by the view as he stood before the basin at the rear of the car, for even now they were passing over Turin. It was a blur of light, vivid and beautiful, that shone beneath him in the midst of this gulf of darkness, sweeping away southwards into the gloom as the car sped on towards the Alps. How little, he thought, seemed this great city seen from above, and yet how mighty it was. It was from that glimmer, already 5 miles behind, that Italy was controlled. In one of these dolls' houses of which he had caught a glimpse, men sat in council over souls and bodies, and abolished God, and smiled at his church. And God allowed it all, and made no sign. It was there that Felsenburgh had been, a month or two ago. Felsenburgh, his devil. And again the mental sword tore and stabbed at his heart. A few minutes later, 4 ecclesiastics were sitting at their round table in the little screened compartment of the dining room in the bows of the airship. It was an excellent dinner, served as usual from the kitchens, in the bow of the volor, and rose, course by course, with a smooth click, into each center of the table. There was a bottle of red wine to each diner, and both the table and chairs swung easily to the very slight motion of the ship. But they did not talk much, and there was only one subject possible of the 2 cardinals, and the chaplains had not yet been admitted into the full secret. It was growing cold now, and even the hot air footrests did not quite compensate for the deathly iciness of the breath that began to stream down from the Alps, which the ship was now approaching at a slight incline. It was necessary to rise at least 9,000 feet from the usual level in order to pass the frontier of the Mont Cenis at the safe angle. At the same time, it was necessary to go a little slower over the Alps themselves, owing to the extreme rarity of the air and the difficulty in causing the screw to revolve sufficiently quickly to counteract it. "There will be clouds tonight," said a voice clear and distinct from the passage, as the door swung slightly to a movement of the car. Percy got up and closed it. The German cardinal began to grow a little fidgety towards the end of dinner. "I shall go back," he said at last. "I shall be better in my fur rug." His chaplain dutifully went after him, leaving his own dinner unfinished, and Percy was left alone with Father Corcoran, his English chaplain, lately from Scotland. He finished his wine, ate a couple of figs, and then sat staring out through the plate-glass window in front. "Ah," he said, "excuse me, Father. There are the Alps at last." The front of the car consisted of 3 divisions. In the center of one which stood the steersman, his eyes looking straight ahead, and his hands upon the wheel. On either side of him, separated from him by aluminum walls, was contrived a narrow slip of a compartment, with a long curved window at the height of a man's eyes, through which a magnificent view could be obtained. It was to one of these that Percy went, passing along the corridor, and seeing through the half-open doors other parties still over their wine. He pushed the spring door on the left and went through. He had crossed the Alps 3 times before in his life, and well remembered the extraordinary effect they had had on him, especially as he had once seen them from a great altitude upon a clear day. An eternal, immeasurable sea of white ice, broken by hummocks and wrinkles, that from below were soaring peaks named and reverenced, and beyond, the spherical curve of the earth's edge, that dropped into a haze of air into unutterable space. But this time they seemed more amazing than ever, and he looked out on them with the interest of a sick child. The car was now ascending rapidly towards the pass up across the huge tumbled slopes, ravines, and cliffs that lie like outwards of the enormous wall. Seen from this height, they were in themselves comparatively insignificant, but they at least struggled, or suggested, the vastness of the bastions, which they would no more than buttress. As Percy turned, he could see the moonless sky alight with frosty stars, and the dimness of the illumination made the scene even more impressive. But as he turned again, there was a change. The vast air about him seemed now to be perceived through frosted glass. The velvet blackness of the pine forests had faded to heavy gray, the pale glint of water and ice seen and gone again in a moment, the monstrous nakedness of rock spires and slopes, rising towards him and sliding away again beneath a crawling motion. All these had lost their distinctness of outline, and were veiled in invisible white. As he looked yet higher to right and left, the sight became terrifying, for the giant walls of rock rushing towards him, the huge grotesque shapes towering on all sides, ran upward into a curtain of cloud visible only from the dancing radiance thrown upon it by the brilliantly lighted car. Even as he looked, two straight fingers of splendor, resembling horns, shot out, as the bow searchlights were turned on, and the car itself, already traveling at half speed, dropped to quarter speed, and began to sway softly from side to side as the huge airplanes beat the mist through which they moved, and the antenna of light pierced it. Still up they went, and on, yet swift enough to let Percy see one great pinnacle rear itself, elongate, sink down into a cruel needle, and vanish into nothingness a few thousand feet below. The motion grew yet more nauseous as the car moved up at a sharp angle, preserving its level, simultaneously rising, advancing, and swaying. Once hoarse and sonorous, an unfrozen torrent roared like a beast. It seemed within 20 yards, and was dumb again on the instant. Now, too, the horns began to cry, long lamentable hootings, ringing sadly in that echoing desolation like the wail of wandering souls. And as Percy, awed beyond feeling, wiped the gathering moisture from the glass, and stared again, it appeared as if he floated now, motionless except for the slight rocking beneath his feet, in a world of whiteness, as remote from the earth as from heaven, poised in hopeless infinite space, blind, alone, frozen, lost in a white hell of desolation. Once, as he stared, a huge whiteness moved towards him through the veil, slid slowly sideways and down, disclosing, as the car veered, a gigantic slope, smooth as oil, with one cluster of black rock cutting it like the fingers of a man's hand groping from a mountainous wave. Then, as once more the car cried aloud like a lost sheep, there answered it. It seemed scarcely 10 yards away. First one windy scream of dismay, and another, and another. A clang of bells, a chorus broke out, and the air was full of beating wings. Part 4. There was one horrible instant before a clang of a bell, the answering scream, and a whirling motion showed that the steersman was alert. Then like a stone the car dropped, and Percy clutched at the rail before him to steady the terrible sensation of falling into emptiness. He could hear behind him the crash of crockery, the bumping of heavy bodies, as the car again checked on its wide wings. A rush of footsteps broke out, and a cry or two of dismay. Outside, but high and far away, the hooting went on. The air was full of it, and in a flash he recognized that it could not be 1 or 10 or 20 cars, but at least 100 that had answered the call, and that somewhere overhead were hooting and flapping. The invisible ravines and cliffs on all sides took up the crying. Long wails whooped and moaned and died amidst a clash of bells, further and further every instant, but now in every direction, behind, above, in front, and far to right and left. Once more the car began to move, sinking in a long still curve towards the face of the mountain, and as it checked and began to sway again on its huge wings, he turned to the door, seeing as he did so, through the cloudy windows, in the glow of light, a spire of rock not 30 feet below the rising of the mist, and one smooth boulder of snow curving away into invisibility. Within, the car showed brutal signs of the sudden check. The doors of the dining compartments, as he passed along, were flung wide. Glasses, plates, pools of wine and tumbled fruit rolled to and fro on the heaving floors. One man, sitting helplessly on the ground, rolled vacant, terrified eyes upon the priest. He glanced in at the door through which he had come just now, and Father Corcoran staggered up from his seat and came toward him, reeling at the motion underfoot. Simultaneously there was a rush from the opposite door, where the party of Americans had been dining, and as Percy, beckoning with his head, turned again to go down to the stern end of the ship, he found the narrow passage blocked with the crowd that had run out. A babel of talking and cries made questions impossible, and Percy, with his chaplain behind him, gripped the aluminum paneling, and step by step began to make his way in search of his friends. Halfway down the passage, as he pushed and struggled, a voice made itself heard above the din, and in the momentary silence that followed, again sounded the faraway crying of the volors overhead. "Seats, gentlemen, seats," roared the voice. "We are moving immediately." Then the crowd melted as the conductor came through, red-faced and determined, and Percy, springing into his wake, found his way clear to the stern. The cardinal seemed none the worse. He had been asleep, he explained, and saved himself in time from rolling onto the floor, but his old face twitched as he talked. "But what is it?" he said. "What is the meaning?" Father Becklin related how he had actually seen one of the troop of volors within 5 yards of the window. It was crowded with faces, he said, from stem to stern. Then it had suddenly soared and vanished into the whirls of mist. Percy shook his head, saying nothing. He had no explanation. "They are inquiring, I understand," said Father Becklin again. The conductor was at his instrument just now. There was nothing to be seen from the windows now. Only, as Percy stared out, still dazed with the shock, he saw the cruel needle of rock wavering beneath as if through water, and a huge shoulder of snow swaying softly up and down. It was quieter outside. It appeared that the flock had passed. Only somewhere, from an infinite height, still sounded a fitful wailing, as if a lonely bird were wandering, lost in space. "That is the signaling, Valor," murmured Percy to himself. He had no theory, no suggestion, yet the matter seemed an ominous one. It was unheard of that an encounter with 100 volors should take place, and he wondered why they were going southwards. Again the name Felsenburgh came to his mind. What if that sinister man was still somewhere overhead? "Eminence," began the old man again. But that instant the car began to move. A bell clanged, a vibration tingled underfoot, and then, soft as a flake of snow, the great ship began to rise, its movement perceptible only by the sudden drop and vanishing of the spire of rock at which Percy still stared. Slowly, the snowfield, too, began to flit downwards, a black cleft, whisked smoothly into sight from above, and disappeared again below. And a moment later, once more the car seemed poised in white space as it climbed the slope of air down which it had dropped just now. Against the wind cord rent the atmosphere. This time the answer was as faint and distant as a cry from another world. The speed quickened, and the steady throb of the screw began to replace the swaying motion of the wings. Again came the hoot, wild and echoing through the barren wilderness of rock walls beneath, and again, with a sudden impulse, the car soared. It was going in great circles now, cautious as a cat, climbing, climbing, punctuating the ascent, with cry after cry, searching the blind air for dangers. Once again a vast white slope came into sight, illuminated by the glare from the windows, sinking ever more and more swiftly, receding and approaching, until for one instant a jagged line of rocks grinned like teeth through the mist, dropped away and vanished, and with a clash of bells, and the last scream of warning, the throb of the screw passed from a whir to a rising note, and the note to stillness, as the huge ship, clear at last of the frontier peaks, shook out her wings steady once more, and set out for her humming flight through space. Whatever it was behind them now, vanished into the thick night. There was a sound of talking from the interior of the car, hasty, breathless voices, questioning, exclaiming, and the authoritative terse answer of the guard. A step came along outside, and Percy sprang to meet it, but, as he laid his hand on the door, it was pushed from without, and to his astonish the English guard came straight through, closing it behind him. He stood there, looking strangely at the four priests, with compressed lips and anxious eyes. "Well?" cried Percy. "All right, gentlemen, but I'm thinking you'd better descend at Paris. I know who you are, gentlemen, and though I'm not a Catholic—" He stopped again. "For God's sakes, man," began Percy. "Oh, the news, gentlemen. Well, it was 200 cars going to Rome. There was a Catholic plot, sir, discovered in London. Well, to wipe out the Abbey. So they're going, yes, sir, to wipe out Rome." Then he was gone again. Chapter 7, Part 1. It was nearly 16 o'clock on the same day, the last day of the year, that Mabel went into the little church that stood in the street beneath her house. The dark was falling softly, layer on layer. Across the roofs to westward burned the smoldering fire of the winter sunset, and the interior was full of the dying light. She had slept a little in her chair that afternoon, and had awakened with that strange cleansed sense of spirit and mind that sometimes follows such sleep. She wondered later how she could have slept at such a time, and above all, how it was that she had perceived nothing of that cloud of fear and fury that even now was falling over the town and country alike. She remembered afterwards an unusual busyness on the broad tracks beneath her as she had looked out on them from her windows, and an unusual calling of horns and whistles. But she thought nothing of it, and passed down an hour later for a meditation in the church. She had grown to love the quiet place, and came in often like this to steady her thoughts and concentrate them on the significance that lay beneath the surface of life, the huge principles upon which all lived, and which so plainly were the true realities. Indeed, such devotion was becoming almost recognized among certain classes of people. Addresses were delivered now and then. Little books were being published as guides to the interior life, curiously resembling the old Catholic books on mental prayer. She went today to her usual seat, sat down, folded her hands, looked for a minute or two upon the old stone sanctuary, the white image, and the darkening window. Then she closed her eyes and began to think, according to the method she followed. First, she concentrated her attention on herself, detaching it from all that was merely external and transitory, withdrawing it inwards until she found that secret spark which, beneath all frailties and activities, made her a substantial member of the divine race of humankind. This then was the first step. The second consisted in an act of the intellect, followed by one of the imagination. All men possessed that spark, she considered, and then she sent out her powers, sweeping with the eyes of her mind the seething world, seeing beneath the light and dark of the two hemispheres the countless millions of mankind, children coming into the world, old men leaving it, the mature rejoicing in it and their own strength. Back through the ages she looked, through those centuries of crime and blindness, as the race rose through savagery and superstition to a knowledge of themselves, on through the ages yet to come, as generation followed generation to some climax whose perfection, she told herself, she could not fully comprehend because she was not of it. Yet, she told herself again, that climax had already been born. The birth pangs were over. For had not he come, by who was their heir of time? Then, by a third and vivid act, she realized the unity of all, the central fire of which each spark was but a radiation. That vast, passionless, divine being, realizing himself up through these centuries, yet one, yet many. Him whom men had called God, now no longer unknown, but recognized as the transcendental total of themselves. Him who now, with the coming of the new Savior, had stirred and awakened and shown himself as one. And there she stayed, contemplating the vision of her mind, detaching now this virtue, now that for particular assimilation, dwelling on her deficiencies, seeing in the whole the fulfillment of all aspirations, the sum of all of which men had hoped, that spirit of peace, so long hindered, yet generated too perpetually by the passions of the world, forced into outline and being by the energy of individual lives, realizing itself in pulse after pulse, dominant at last, serene, manifest, and triumphant. There she stayed, losing the sense of individuality, merging it by a long sustained effort of the will, drinking, as she thought, long breaths of the spirit of life and love. Some sound, she supposed afterwards, disturbed her, and she opened her eyes, and there before her lay the quiet pavement, glimmering through the dusk, the step of the sanctuary, the rostrum on the right, and the peaceful space of darkening air, above the white mother figure, and against the tracery of the old window. It was here that men had worshipped Jesus, that blood-stained man of sorrow, who had borne, even on his own confession, not peace, but a sword. And they had knelt, those blind and hopeless Christians. Ah, the pathos of it all! The despairing acceptance of any creed that would account for sorrow, the wild worship of any God who claimed to bear it. And again came the sound, striking across her peace, though as yet she did not understand why. It was nearer now, and she turned in astonishment to look down the dusty nave. It was from without that the sound had come, that strange murmur that rose and fell again as she listened. She stood up, her heart quickening a little. Only once before she had heard such a sound, once before, in a square, or where men raged about a point beneath a platform. She stepped swiftly out of her seat, passed down the aisle, drew back the curtains beneath the west window, lifted the latch and stepped out. The street, from where she looked over the railings that barred the entrance to the church, seemed unusually empty and dark. Right and left stretched the houses. Overhead the darkening sky was flushed with rose, but it seemed as if the public lights had been forgotten. There was not a living being to be seen. She had put her hand on the latch of the gate to open it and go out, when a sudden patter of footsteps made her hesitate. In the next instant a child appeared, panting, breathless and terrified, running with her hands before her. "They're coming," sobbed the child, seeing the face looking at her. Then she clung to the bars, staring over her shoulder. Mabel lifted the latch in an instant. The child sprang in, ran to the door, and beat against it. Then turning, seized her dress and cowered behind her. Mabel shut the gate. There, she said. "Who is it? Who are coming?" But the child hid her face, drawing at the kindly skirts, and the next moment came the roar of voices and the trampling of footsteps. It was not more than a few seconds before the heralds of that grim procession came past. First came a flying squadron of children, laughing, terrified, fascinated, screaming, turning their heads as they ran, with a dog or two yelping among them, and a few women drifting sideways along the pavements. a face of a man, Mabel saw as she glanced in terror upwards, had appeared at the windows opposite, pale and eager, some invalid no doubt dragging himself to see. One group, a well-dressed man in gray, a couple of women carrying babies, a solemn-faced boy, halted immediately before her on the other side of the railings, all talking, none listening, and these too turned their faces to the road on the left, up which every instant the clamor of the trampling grew. Yet she could not ask. Her lips moved, but no sound came from them. She was one incarnate apprehension. Across her intense fixity moved pictures of no importance of Oliver as he had been at breakfast, of her own bedroom with its softened paper, of the dark sanctuary and the white figure on which she had just looked just now. They were coming thicker now. A troop of young men with their arms linked swayed into sight, all talking or crying aloud, none listening. All across the roadway, and behind them surged the crowd, like a wave in a stone-fenced channel, male scarcely distinguishable from female in that pack of faces, and under that sky that grew darker every instant. Except for the noise, which Mabel had now hardly noticed, so thick and incessant it was, so complete her concentration in the sense of sight. Except for that, it might have been, from its suddenness and overwhelming force, some mob of phantoms trooping on a sudden out of some vista of the spiritual world visible across an open space, and about to vanish again in obscurity. That empty street was full now on this side, and that so far she could see. Young men were gone, running or walking she hardly knew, round the corner to the right, and the entire space was one stream of heads and faces, pressing so fiercely that the group at the railings were detached like weeds, and drifted too, sideways, clutching at the bars, and swept away too, and vanished. And all the while the child struggled and tore at her skirts. Certain things began to appear now above the heads of the crowd, objects she could not distinguish in the failing light, poles and fantastic shapes, fragments of stuff resembling banners, moving as if alive, turning from side to side, born from beneath. Faces, distorted with passion, looked at her from time to time as the moving show went past. Open mouths cried at her, but she hardly saw them. She was watching those strange emblems, straining her eyes through the dusk, striving to distinguish the battered, broken shapes, half guessing, yet afraid to guess. Then, on a sudden, from the hidden lamps beneath the eaves, light leapt into being, that strong, sweet, familiar light, generated by the great engines underground that, in the passion of that catastrophic day, all men had forgotten, and in a moment all changed from a mob of phantoms and shapes into a pitiless reality of life and death. Before she moved a great rood with a figure on it, of which one arm hung from the nailed hand, swinging as it went. An embroidery streamed behind with the swiftness of the motion. And next after it came the naked body of a child, impaled, white and ruddy, the head fallen upon the breast, and the arms too, dangling and turning. And next the figure of a man, hanging by the neck, dressed, it seemed, in a kind of black gown and cape, with its black-capped head twisting from the twisting rope. Part 2. The same night Oliver Brand came home about an hour before midnight. For himself, what he had heard and seen that day was still too vivid and too imminent for him to judge of it coolly. He had seen, from his windows at Whitehall, Parliament Square filled with a mob the like of which had not been known in England since the days of Christianity, a mob full of fury that could scarcely draw its origin except from sources beyond the reach of sense. Thrice during the hours that followed the publication of the Catholic plot and the outbreak of mob law, he had communicated with the Prime Minister, asking whether nothing could be done to allay the tumult. And on both occasions he had received the doubtful answer that what could be done would be done, that force was inadmissible at present, but that the police were doing all that was possible. As regarded the dispatch of the volors to Rome, he had assented by silence, as had the rest of the council. That was, Snowford had said, a judicial punitive act, regrettable but necessary. Peace, in this instant, could not be secured except on terms of war, or rather, since war was obsolete, by the sternness of justice. These Catholics had shown themselves the avowed enemies of society. Very well, then society must defend itself, at least this once. Man was still human, and Oliver had listened and said nothing. As he passed in one of the government volors over London on his way home, he had caught more than one glimpse of what was proceeding beneath him. The streets were as bright as day, shadowless and clear in the white light, and every roadway was a crawling serpent. From beneath rose up a steady roar of voices, soft and woolly, punctuated by cries. From here or there ascended the smoke of burning, and once, as he flitted over one of the great squares to the south of Battersea, he had seen it, were a scattered squadron of ants running as if in fear or pursuit. He knew what was happening. Well, after all, man was not yet perfectly civilized. He did not like to think of what awaited him at home. Once, about 5 hours earlier, he had listened to his wife's voice through the telephone, and what he had heard had nearly caused him to leave all and go to her. Yet he was scarcely prepared for what he found. As he came into the sitting room, there was no sound, except that far-away hum from the seething streets below. The room seemed strangely dark and cold. The only light that entered was through one of the windows from which the curtains were withdrawn, and, silhouetted against the luminous sky beyond, was the upright figure of a woman, looking and listening. He pressed the knob of the electric light, and Mabel turned slowly towards him. She was in her day dress, with a cloak thrown over her shoulders, and her face was almost as that of a stranger. It was perfectly colorless. Her lips were compressed and her eyes full of an emotion which he could not interpret. It might equally have been anger, terror, or misery. She stood there in the steady light, motionless, looking at him. For a moment he did not trust himself to speak. He passed across to the window, closed it, and drew the curtains. Then he took that rigid figure gently by the arm. "Mabel," he said. "Mabel." She submitted to be drawn towards the sofa, but there was no response to his touch. He sat down and looked up at her with a kind of despairing apprehension. "My dear, I am tired out," he said. Still she looked at him. There was in her pose that rigidity that actors simulate, yet he knew it for the real thing. He had seen that silence once or twice before in the presence of a horror. Once, at any rate, at the sight of a splash of blood on her shoe. "Well, my darling, sit down at least," he said. She obeyed him mechanically, sat, and still stared at him. In the silence once more that soft roar rose and died from the invisible world of tumult outside the windows. Within here all was quiet. He knew perfectly that two things strove within her, her loyalty to her faith and her hatred of those crimes in the name of justice. As he looked on, he saw that these two were at death grips, that hatred was prevailing, and that she herself was little more than a passive battlefield. Then, as with a long-drawn howl of a wolf, there surged and sank the voices of the mob a mile away. The tension broke. She threw herself forward towards him. He caught her by the wrists, and so she rested, clasped in his arms, her face and bosom on his knees, her whole body torn by emotion. For a full minute neither spoke. Oliver understood well enough, yet at present he had no words. He only drew her a little closer to himself, kissed her hair 2 or 3 times, and settled himself to hold her. He began to rehearse what he must say presently. Then she raised her flushed face for an instant, looked at him passionately, dropped her head again and began to sob out broken words. He could only catch a sentence here or there, yet he knew what she was saying. It was the ruin of all her hopes, she sobbed, the end of her religion. Let her die, die and have done with it. It was all gone, gone, swept away in this murderous passion of the people of her faith. They were no better than Christians, after all, as fierce as the men on whom they avenged themselves, as dark as though Savior, Julian, had never come. It was all lost. War and passion and murder had returned to the body from which she had thought them gone forever. The burning churches, the hunted Catholics, the raging of the streets on which she had looked that day, the bodies of the child and the priest carried on poles, the burning churches and convents, all streamed out, incoherent, broken by sobs, details of horror, lamentations, reproaches, interpreted by the writhing of her head and the hands upon his knees. The collapse was complete. He put his hands again beneath her arms and raised her. He was worn out by his work, yet he knew he must quiet her. This was more serious than any previous crisis, yet he knew her power of recovery. "Sit down, my darling," he said. "There, give me your hands. Now listen to me." He made really an admirable defense, for it was what he had been repeating to himself all day. Men were not yet perfect, he said. There ran in their veins the blood of men who for 20 centuries had been Christians. There must be no despair. Faith in man was of the very essence of religion, faith in man's best self, in what he would become, not in what at present he actually was. They were at the beginning of a new religion, not in its maturity. There must be sourness in the young fruit. Consider, too, the provocation. Remember the appalling crime that these Catholics had contemplated. They had set themselves to strike the new faith in its very heart. "My darling," he said, "men are not changed in an instant. What if those Christians had succeeded? I condemn it all as strongly as you. I saw a couple of newspapers this afternoon, and that are as wicked as anything that the Christians had ever done. They exulted in all these crimes. It will throw the movement back 10 years. Do you think that there are not thousands like yourself who hate and detest this violence? But what does faith mean, except that we know that mercy will prevail? Faith, patience, and hope, these are our weapons." He spoke with passionate conviction, his eyes fixed on hers, in a fierce endeavor to give her his own confidence, and to reassure the remnants of his own doubtfulness. It was true that he too hated what she hated, yet he saw things that she did not. Well, well, he told himself, we must remember that she was a woman. The look of frantic horror passed slowly out of her eyes, giving way to an acute misery as they talked, and as his personality once more began to dominate her own. But it was not yet over. "But the volors," she cried, "the volors. That is deliberate. It is not the work of a mob." "My darling, it is no more deliberate than the other. We are all human. We are all immature." Yes, the council permitted it. Permitted it, remember. The German government, too, had to yield. We must tame nature slowly. We must not break it. He talked again for a few minutes, repeating his arguments, soothing, reassuring, encouraging, and he saw that he was beginning to prevail. But she returned to one of his words. "Permitted it? And you permitted it?" "Dear, I said nothing, either for it or against. I tell you that if we had forbidden it, there would have been yet more murder, and the people would have lost their rulers. We were passive, since we could do nothing." But it would have been better to die. Oh, Oliver, let me die at least. I cannot bear it." By her hands, which he still held, he drew her nearer yet to himself. "Sweetheart," he said gravely, "cannot you trust me a little? If I could tell you all that passed today, you would understand. But trust me, I am not heartless. And what of Julian Felsenburgh?" For a moment he saw hesitation in her eyes. Her loyalty to him and her loathing of all that had happened strove within her. Then once again loyalty prevailed. The name of Felsenburgh weighed down the balance, and trust came back with a flood of tears. "Oh, Oliver," she said, "I know I trust you, but I am so weak, and all is so terrible, and he is so strong and merciful. And will he be with us tomorrow?" It struck midnight from the clock tower a mile away as they yet sat and talked. She was still tremulous from the struggle, but she looked at him smiling, still holding his hands. He saw that the reaction was upon her in full force at last. "The new year, my husband," she said, and rose as she said it, drawing him after her. "I wish you a happy New Year," she said. "Oh, help me, Oliver." She kissed him and drew back, still holding his hands, looking at him with bright, tearful eyes. "Oliver," she cried again, "I must tell you this. Do you know what I thought before you came?" He shook his head, staring at her greedily. How sweet she was. He felt her grip tighten on his hands. "I thought I could not bear it," she whispered. "That I must end it all. Ah, you know what I mean." His heart flinched as he heard her, and he drew her closer again to himself. "It is all over. It is all over," she cried. "Ah, do not look like that. I could not help you if it was not." As their lips met again, there came the vibration of an electric bell from the next room, and Oliver, knowing what it meant, felt even in that instant a tremor shake his heart. He loosed her hands and still smiled at her. "The bell," she said with a flash of apprehension. "But it is all well between us again." Her face steadied itself into loyalty and confidence. "It is all well," she said, and again the impatient bell tingled. "Go, Oliver. I will wait here." A minute later he was back again, with a strange look on his white face and his lips compressed. He came straight up to her, taking her once more by the hands and looking steadily into her steady eyes. In the hearts of both of them, resolve and faith were holding down the emotion that was not yet dead. He drew a long breath. "Yes," he said in an even voice, "it is over." Her lips moved, and that deadly paleness lay on her cheeks. He gripped her firmly. "Listen," he said, "you must face it. It is over. Rome is gone. Now we must build something better." She threw herself sobbing into his arms.